Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for being here. In your statement, you mentioned Russia 6 times, as you should. They're clearly involved, but there's an omission. I do not believe that in your testimony you mention Iran a single time. And in fact, until Senator Cardin just raised it, I'm not sure it had even been discussed yet in terms of Iran's role in this region. Earlier this month, you said you couldn't guarantee to the American people that the funds that Iran has received as a result of the payments that were made and of the JCPOA have not been used for terrorism. I think it's common sense that, in fact, they would do that. We've seen, for example, press reports that Iran's Guardian Council instructed its central bank to transfer $1.7 billion to the military of Iran. And by the way, I don't think that number is a coincidence. So we've seen the top IRGC commander last week say that the IRGC and its allies supply intelligence for Russian airstrikes in Syria. And so I think the first thing we have to point to here is the fact that these pallets of taxpayer dollars that have been allowed to Iran have ultimately helped them help Russia target innocent Syrians in this quest to increase their dominance of the region or their role in the region and to prop up Assad. And again, I don't know how we justify the transfer of all of these funds to the Iranian regime, knowing that the Iranian regime is deeply involved in propping up the Assad regime and in the process providing assistance to all these atrocities that are about to be committed by both Assad and the Russians. How do we justify that?
Thank you, Senator. First, as you know, because you've been so focused on this for many years, Iran has been engaged in the support of terrorism, in destabilizing activities, including in Syria, for a long time, during sanctions, in other words, before the nuclear agreement, during the negotiation of the agreement, and indeed since sanctions have been lifted in the context of that agreement. So their conduct has been consistent throughout. And again, they were doing this before, when we had the sanctions regime in place because of their nuclear program. The one thing that has changed is we have taken a nuclear weapon off the table far into the future, which is profoundly good for our interests and the interests of our partners and allies. But as we've said all along, we fully expected that they would continue to take these actions in various ways, in various places, after the agreement. And that's why we have worked very hard to continue and indeed to increase our efforts to counter them. So we've worked very closely, as you know, with the Gulf partners, building up their capacity. We just signed a record-breaking MOU with Israel to make sure that they had in place over the next decade what they need for their security. And we continue to implement sanctions against Iranian entities.
But I apologize. So the one thing that's changed, that basically they were involved in terror before, they're involved in terror now, and I consider their support of Assad to be part of that. Mm-hmm. That the only thing that's changed is that now we've made it harder for them to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. I would say a second thing has changed, and is that they now have access to millions and millions of dollars they didn't have access to before. So you have the world's key sponsor of terrorism now has millions of dollars more than they once did. There's no evidence that they're using it to build hospitals, bridges, roads, orphanages, sponsor food programs around the world. We don't see aid convoys from Iran providing food and medicine to people suffering in Syria. What we see is an increased amount of support for the Assad regime and the sponsorship of terrorism. So one of the things that's changed is they now have access to millions of dollars they didn't have a year and a half ago.
Senator, our best assessment...
billions, I apologize, billions.
Our best assessment is that given Iran's very significant economic difficulties, the vast bulk of the resources that they've had access to as a result of the agreement or as a result of the Hague settlement, these funds have been dedicated to the domestic economy, not to regional activities. Under the nuclear agreement, we believe that they now have access to roughly $50 billion that had been frozen or restricted in foreign accounts. They need $500 billion to meet their investment needs, government obligations, propping up their currency, et cetera. And as I said, they've engaged, alas, in these activities before, during, and after. And also, unfortunately, a lot of the support that they're providing to terror, to proxies, is not very resource intensive. So that's why, even as we have implemented the agreement, which in our judgment is a very good thing for our security and that of our allies and partners, we have worked to intensify our efforts to counter these activities.
But even if we assume what you said is true, that the money's been used to prop up their domestic economy, ultimately, if that were the case, that domestic economy would then produce more revenue that they could use to fulfill the funding needs of their priorities, which is terrorism and the propping up of Assad. I guess the point for the average American who's watching this issue, here's the bottom line. You have the world's supreme sponsor of terrorism, who now has billions of dollars more than they once did as a result of this. And we're somehow supposed to believe that the bulk of it is being spent to improve the way their economy functions, and that somehow, because funds are fungible, that this is not being used to increase their other aims that they have around the world, and that includes the propping up of this extraordinarily vicious regime on Assad and their enablers in Russia. And so, again, I think this is just another example of how this deal and everything that surrounds it has now provided more resources to the Iranian regime to continue to do what they did. And one of the things they do with the money that they've been given is they are able to fund their intelligence gathering capabilities that allow them to help the Russians with their airstrikes. And those are the airstrikes that struck a convoy a week ago. Those are the airstrikes that are decimating Aleppo and creating a situation on the ground that we have not seen in decades anywhere in the world.